You may have noticed something subtle recently. Not dramatic, not disruptive. Just a quiet shift in how you register moments. The way you pause slightly longer before reacting. The way certain thoughts no longer pull you as strongly as they once did. It's not something that announces itself. It's something you notice only after it has already begun. And the fact that you're noticing it at all is worth observing calmly, without trying to label it too quickly. This video isn't here to tell you that something extraordinary has happened to you. It's not here to elevate or single you out. Instead, it's an opportunity to look at a very ordinary process that most people experience at different points in their lives, often without language for it. A process related to awareness, attention, and the way perception subtly reorganizes itself over time. You're not here because you're ahead of others. You're here because you noticed something and chose to look at it rather than dismiss it. That choice alone doesn't make you different. It just makes you attentive in this moment. Awareness is not a switch. It doesn't turn on suddenly. It shifts in small increments, often in ways that feel almost unremarkable at first. You may still think the same thoughts. You may still have the same routines, but the relationship you have with those thoughts and routines begins to change. They're still present, but they don't fully occupy you in the same way. This is where the idea of frequency is often misunderstood, not as a mystical force or a measurable signal, but as a useful metaphor. Frequency, in this context, refers to the rate at which certain patterns of attention repeat. What you notice, what you return to mentally, what holds your focus without effort. Over time, these patterns shape your internal experience more than external circumstances do. When awareness shifts, frequency doesn't rise or fall in any dramatic sense. It redistributes. Certain mental loops lose momentum. Others become more visible. Not because they're stronger, but because you're no longer fully inside them. You're observing them as they occur. Observation changes things, but not by force. When you notice a thought as a thought, it naturally behaves differently. Not better, not worse, just differently. It no longer claims the entire field of your attention. It becomes one element among many. You might recognize this in simple moments. A reaction that used to arrive instantly now has a brief pause before it completes itself. A familiar frustration still appears, but it feels less personal, less defining. You don't suppress it. You don't analyze it. You just notice it. And that noticing slightly alters the experience. This doesn't mean you're becoming detached from life. It often means the opposite. When awareness widens, experience becomes more textured, not less. Sounds register more clearly. Conversations feel more layered. Silence feels less empty. None of this is dramatic. It's subtle enough that you might doubt it's happening at all. That doubt is part of the process. Awareness doesn't announce itself as certainty. It often arrives as quiet curiosity, a sense that there's more space around your thoughts than there used to be. More room between stimulus and response. More capacity to let things pass without needing to resolve them immediately. This is not about improvement. It's about clarity. And clarity doesn't always feel comfortable. Sometimes it simply feels neutral. You see patterns you didn't see before, not to judge them, but to recognize their shape, how often they repeat, what triggers them, how long they last when they're not fed additional attention. At this stage, many people try to define what's happening too quickly. They look for labels, frameworks, explanations that promise direction or outcome. But awareness doesn't move in straight lines. It doesn't progress according to effort. It deepens according to observation. Consider how attention works in everyday situations. When you're fully absorbed in a task, time feels different. When your mind is scattered, time fragments. These are not changes in reality itself, but changes in how awareness is distributed. The same principle applies internally. A shift in awareness doesn't mean you stop thinking. It means you notice thinking. You notice how thoughts arise, overlap, fade, and return. We begin to recognize that many of them are recycled, familiar, predictable. Not because they're wrong, but because they're habitual. This recognition doesn't require you to change anything. In fact, trying to change it often pulls you back into the pattern. Observation works precisely because it's non-interfering. It allows the system to reveal itself. You may notice that certain external inputs affect you differently now. News, conversations, media that once held your attention may feel slightly louder or slightly flatter. Again, not better or worse, just different. Your nervous system responds based on what it's used to processing. When awareness widens, overstimulation becomes more noticeable. This doesn't mean withdrawal is required. It means discernment becomes more natural. You don't need to eliminate anything. You simply become aware of what you're giving your attention to and how that attention feels over time. There's a common misconception that awareness leads to constant calm. In reality, it leads to accuracy. You feel what you feel, but with less distortion. Emotions pass through more cleanly. They're less tangled with narrative, less burdened by interpretation. You might still experience stress, but you notice the difference between the sensation of stress and the story about it. That distinction alone changes how long it lingers. This continues, you may find that you're less interested in conclusions, less motivated to arrive at fixed answers. Curiosity replaces certainty, not because certainty is wrong, but because it feels less necessary. This can be disorienting at first. The mind likes resolution. It likes knowing what something means and what to do with it. Awareness doesn't always provide that immediately. Sometimes it simply opens a space and leaves it open. That openness is not emptiness. It's capacity, the ability to hold complexity without needing to simplify it prematurely. If you look closely, you might notice that this shift didn't start recently. It may have been unfolding quietly for a long time. Small moments of noticing that didn't seem important at the time. A gradual change in how you listen, how you wait, how you respond. Nothing was added. Something was noticed. And this is where observation becomes self-reinforcing. Not in a way that accelerates endlessly, but in a way that stabilizes. The more you notice without interference, the more natural noticing becomes, not as a practice, but as a default orientation. This is not something you achieve. It's something that reveals itself when conditions allow, often after periods of overload, repetition, or quiet dissatisfaction. Not as a solution, but as a recalibration. You may notice that conversations feel different now. You listen not just to words, but to tone, pacing, pauses. You notice what isn't said as clearly as what is. This isn't a skill you trained. It's a sensitivity that emerged when attention stopped rushing ahead. You may also notice that you're less inclined to defend every position, less reactive to disagreement. Not because you lack perspective, but because you're more aware of how perspectives form. Thoughts arise from context, mood, memory, habit. Seeing this doesn't make thoughts irrelevant. It makes them understandable. As awareness deepens, It often feels less like something is happening to you, and more like something is being seen through you. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Experience flows, and awareness tracks it without clinging. This doesn't remove responsibility. It clarifies it. You still choose how to act. But those choices come from a clearer understanding of what's actually occurring, rather than from automatic patterns. You may find that silence becomes more comfortable, not because there's nothing to think about, but because thinking doesn't need to fill every gap. Silence becomes another texture of experience rather than an absence to be avoided. At this point, many people wonder where this leads. That question itself is understandable. The mind wants trajectory, but awareness doesn't move toward a destination. It moves toward accuracy in the present. That doesn't mean growth stops. It means growth looks different, less like accumulation, more like refinement. You may begin to notice how often attention jumps ahead of experience. Planning, predicting, rehearsing. None of this is wrong. It's functional. But when awareness is present, you also notice when these processes are no longer useful. They continue out of habit rather than necessity. That noticing creates choice, not forced choice. Subtle choice. The option to stay with what's actually happening rather than what might happen. This is where frequency, as a metaphor, becomes clearer. The mind has certain default rhythms, patterns it returns to. Awareness doesn't disrupt those rhythms violently. It simply reveals them. Over time, some lose energy because they're no longer unconscious. Nothing is suppressed. Nothing is overridden. Patterns that are seen clearly often soften on their own. You might notice that you're more patient with ambiguity, less rushed to resolve internal questions, more comfortable letting understanding unfold gradually. This patience isn't passive, it's attentive. It's the willingness to stay with experience long enough for it to show its structure. At times, this can feel like nothing is happening. No insight, no shift, just ordinary moments. That's often when awareness is most active, because it's no longer being compared to an expectation. Expectations create noise. Awareness is quiet not because it lacks content, but because it's not commenting constantly on what it perceives. If you listen closely, you may notice that your internal dialogue has changed tone. Still present, but less insistent, less convincing, more like background commentary than instruction. This doesn't mean you stop thinking critically. It means critical thinking becomes more precise, less entangled wit. H. Emotional charge. More aligned with actual observation. You may also notice a change in how you relate to time. Past and future still exist conceptually, but they exert less pressure. The present moment feels more complete, not because it's perfect, but because it's sufficient. This sufficiency is not complacency, it's realism. The recognition that this moment contains exactly what it contains, no more and no less. As this continues, you may feel drawn to content, conversations, or environments that reflect this clarity, not because others are inferior, but because resonance matters. Attention naturally aligns with what feels coherent. This is not about isolation, it's about alignment. You don't need to withdraw. You simply notice where your attention settles with ease. There is no final stage here, no endpoint where awareness is complete. There is only ongoing observation, sometimes clear, sometimes distracted. Both are part of the process. Distraction is not failure, it's information. Noticing distraction is itself awareness. If you find yourself trying to hold on to this state, That's also something to notice. Grasping is a pattern like any other. Seeing it clearly often loosens it. Nothing needs to be protected. Awareness doesn't disappear because you stop paying attention to it. It reappears whenever attention becomes available again. This is why it's described as a shift rather than a transformation. Shifts can be subtle, reversible, adaptable. They don't require maintenance. They respond to conditions. You may notice that certain questions no longer feel urgent, not because they're answered, but because their urgency was part of the pattern being observed. What remains is a quieter curiosity, a willingness to look without immediately concluding. If you're still watching this, it's likely because something here resonates, not as belief, but as recognition. You're not being told what to think. You're being invited to notice what you're already experiencing.
This channel exists to explore these observations carefully,
Without exaggeration, without promises, without pressure. Just clear language applied to common but often overlooked experiences. If you choose to stay, it's not because you need anything. It's because observation deepens when it's shared thoughtfully. There's no requirement to act on any of this, no practice to adopt, no identity to assume, just the option to continue noticing. And perhaps the most important thing to observe is this: understanding doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds, often slowly, often quietly, often without announcing itself as understanding at all. You may notice more later, or you may simply return to your day with a slightly different relationship to it. Either way, nothing is lost. Awareness doesn't demand attention. It's already present. It only becomes visible when the noise around it softens enough to notice. That softening doesn't need to be forced. It happens when it happens. And you're already observing more than you think.